Welcome once again to Crossroads TV, where we host China experts here on the ground in Shanghai. I'm Frank Tsai, and I run China Crossroads, which is an offline event platform, hosted about 500 events over the last 13 years with speakers who have deep expertise on China. We're putting this online after 13 years because we feel now is the right time. A lot of misunderstanding about China in the world and less and less real expertise of people who've lived and worked here. And really happy to be hosting Lola Woetzel today for this recording. She is actually our most frequent former speaker, and I just counted today, that's 10 talks in 10 years. That's average one a year since 2013. It's not an exaggeration to say probably the most important supporter we've had for China Crossroads over the years. So welcome, Lola. Of course, she's the director of the McKinsey Global Institute here in China.
Well, actually, that brings to the first question. When you came to China, ages ago already, I guess,
yeah.
Why actually did you come to China? Or why did McKinsey actually set up in China?
Well, it was for the cats.
Makes sense.
I don't know how you were going to make that segue, but yeah, I thought I would help.
Sure.
But sort of it was, in that we thought that at the time that China was opening up. It was the beginning days after the economic opening to the outside world started in '78, and actually they came to us. So there was a mission that I remember being part of by a guy named Yuan Baohua, who was the state economic commissioner. And this happened in 1980, must have been 1984. And they came to New York to meet with the head of our firm, Marvin Bauer. And the mission that they had was to understand capitalism. That was the goal.
I can imagine those days.
They came and they sat in our office on somewhere in Midtown, and Marvin was there. And Marvin asked two other people to come: Dick Foster, who was the author of The Attacker's Advantage, the idea of the S-curve, basically, and I believe Sun Yan, who talked something about leadership. So Sun Yan talked about leadership, Dick Foster talked about attacker's advantage, and then Marvin stood up and with 3 organization charts explained capitalism. So he talked about IBM, Alcoa, and GE and differences between business unit leadership and geographic leadership and matrices. And you could see Yuan Baohua, who at that time must have been, I don't know, he looked ancient to me. He was probably 60 or something. So, and you could see his brain kind of ticking over, and he could understand it intellectually, but emotionally it was just like this visceral reaction of like, where's the plan? Where's the control? And we all walked out of that meeting and said, well, that was different. And Marvin was very convinced that China would reform and that we needed to be there. So that was the top level support. And then we found somebody, or somebody found us from inside the firm who was looking for entrepreneurship. And so we said, okay, Terry, you go. He opened it up.
And which year was that they first came into the office?
Well, the office was opened in Hong Kong in 1983, I think. Might have been 84. And I showed up there at the end of 84, beginning of 85. So that was, I joined in the Los Angeles office on May Day, 1984. So.
But those were the days there were not yet any Western multinationals, or very few active in China. I mean, was there any business in those days?
It was sporadic. I mean, there were some multinationals that were looking around, and so those were the days where you do 6 weeks in 6 countries, and China would be one of them. So you would look at it and you would sort of come up with roadmaps for whatever it was, steel trading.
It's like traveling in Europe.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's like all those. So that was the kind of multinational work. What there wasn't was any local work. And the very few local things that happened were subsidized or sponsored. Our very first piece of work was a pro bono project, which we did for something called the State Commission for Economic Restructuring, the Tigaiwei. And I showed up and we gave a report on the foreign investment environment and how to improve it. And at the end of it, in front of all these Mao-suited cadres, the big guy, was Li Tieying, said, not bad for a consultant, but you made one mistake. And I said, oh, what was that? And I'm sort of very concerned. He said, well, you have this chart that says comparative foreign investment environments of different countries, and you listed out, Germany and the United States and Japan.
So you guys came over to teach China capitalism 40 years ago. Did China learn?
Oh yeah, I think they got they got the message. But that was it. It was very much like that. So we were management consultants. So China was, people always like, does China really use consultants? Of course they do. They have lots of consultants, and legal consultants, environmental consultants. There are a lot of those guys. What they didn't have was management consultants because they didn't have management. So they didn't have capitalism. So when we showed up, there were no companies. And this was the days of having the 14 enterprise freedoms. Was the list of freedoms that were being granted to state enterprises, which included such things as the ability to hire and fire, to make capital expenditure decisions, to whatever, develop, integrate your design institutes. Those were very early. So we brought the idea that management was not necessarily a legal structure, that it was not just a collection of assets, that it was a way of thinking about running a business and what a business was. And then, that was news at the time. So now I think we all got that.
That's incredible. I mean, to be part of this. I mean, in many ways, China's development, you've been a huge part of that, and you've seen a very large part of this economic miracle. To have this experience is incredible. What do you say to others, especially abroad, who and all of us who don't have this experience? What do you say about China? What does it mean for China in the future going forward?
Well, I think China is a very much a work in progress. I mean, I think we have to sort of recognize that this process was set in motion. I mean, arguably 100 years ago. And then with fits and starts, and now it's really gone into turbocharge since 1980, and the process will change China, but China is still the product of 4,000 years of Chinese culture and society as well. Yeah. So in that sense, it's not a blank sheet of paper, as was said and called famously in the Cultural Revolution, and there is a lot of dynamism. There's a lot of change, and what's important to get as a foreigner is not so much that, as a business person, I'd say, is not so much that China is big. I think everybody gets that. It's more that China is fast. And it's the speed thing, because the rate of change, the pace of change, the comfort with change is just much greater here than it is in most parts of the world.
Right.
And so that's the main thing to get across.
Yeah.
So in this aspect, what's the message of McKinsey now compared to 10 years ago and then maybe 20 years ago in general towards multinationals or foreign companies?
Well, for multinationals, I mean, I think we're, again, in a very different place than we were 10 or 15 years ago. The high point of multinational participation in the Chinese economy as a share would probably have been sometime in the early 2000s. That's when foreign invested enterprises revenues were, I don't know, something close to 18 or 19% of all revenues, which is crazy if you just think about that. So like 1 out of every 5 RMBs is being revenue to a foreign company.
Yes.
So it's wild. So that is down to closer to 10. And why is largely because of local competition. Or you could argue the other way, that the market just grew faster than foreign competition was able to keep up. So what filled the gap was local. So we're in a different place, and therefore get used to that pace of change. That was done largely because people were not able to keep up with that change that China was going through, and so others folks did. And now we have to sort of recognize the reality that there are strong local competitors across the value chain, that China's no longer simply a market where you bring your stuff, that it is a place where you start to develop things and use technologies that have been developed in the country, and to think about how to use those in a more competitive way. So we used to say China as your second home market. Well, in some businesses, China is your home market. I mean, otherwise you don't have one. So that's a different perspective. Now, that's not all true for everything, of course, and there are plenty of pieces of industry where China is not yet competitive and probably won't be for quite some time. I'm thinking about, some aspects of technology and design, certainly some of the services at higher income levels, but for most of it is. And that really calls the question for what does it mean to be a multinational in this very fractured global environment that we have.
I want to circle back to the question of how capitalist China is. So over these years, you've had private sector Chinese clients, state-owned Chinese clients, and government clients as well. wonder if you could speak to that and, what kind of insights you get about the political economy here, how it differs from the West or the US, from your long experience with these clients.
Well, that's a very fundamental question. I'm not sure how to answer it, really. I mean, I'm not the one to define capitalism. I think that, or the best I can do is that it's a market-based allocation of resources that relies on individuals through their associations with each other to act out the consequences of those make and live those capital allocation decisions. So that's capitalism. So I think there are a couple of differences, obviously, in the Chinese context from many others. One is government is an economic actor in a much bigger way than it is elsewhere. And as a result, there's a lot of government. There's just a lot of different kinds of government. So one of the questions I don't get enough, which I really wish I did from Western audiences, like, how does it work? How does the Chinese government work? Because it's very big. Yeah. There's lots of it.
Right.
And what about central versus local? What actually does the party do when it gets into economic decision making?
Yeah.
If it ever does, and how do some industries work? Be the government's roles and sort of national policy goals. Those are very important questions, and I don't get them enough. But that's one very big difference. And then the other big difference is that, this is a society in transition, and it's not quite there. We know what a modern economy looks like. It's supposed to be urban, services, consumer, productivity. That's what a modern economy looks like. China's not quite there. It's getting there, but it's still a lot of rural investment, quite a bit of industry, and a lot of less than productive kind of environments that are going to change. So those things are also true.
Well, I think a big misconception abroad is that China is this top-down unitary state. And we all know it's very fragmented in different levels with different incentives, which we've all experienced. And I'm kind of curious, you've done so much work on urbanization. Actually, I saw today that your first talk 10 years ago was called China's Urbanization, a Stochastic Process. 10 years ago, and drawing from your work on urbanization here in China, what was it like dealing with these government clients?
Yeah. I like using the word stochastic. It makes me feel like everything is about to change, which, if you take the long enough view on it, then it is stochastic. But no, government was good as clients. We worked only with local governments. Right. So, and as I said, government is an economic actor. So these were people who basically had a piece of land and were told that they needed to create an economy. Yeah. And it should be roughly this big. And that was it. Yeah. They didn't have anything else. So we did what was called 产业规划, or industry planning. Which would basically say, okay, what should we do? And, what kind of industries could potentially this place attract or develop? And, how do you do that? Whether it's the marketing plan or the infrastructure needed or the talent and all that, just lay it out. Because, as they would say, our government's implementation capability is very strong. We just don't know what to do. So please give us some direction. And we, of course, and there was always an expert panel, and there was always going to be there was a bidding process, and procurement became more complicated over time. But a lot of it was just simply about that pace of aspiration. Great. Okay. We want to double the city. That's our goal.
But how to do that?
How to do that. And, and the old stuff is fine. It's not going anywhere, but it's so much more difficult. Yeah. So let's just go with the new things. So that was the exciting part. And government themselves were usually, they seconded somebody in who had some kind of commercial background from something, and they set up a temporary command structure, and they said, okay, this is the working group, and then you'd have these meetings, and you have the 30 different bureaus, and these small number of people trying to coordinate it all, and it was very, very much, you felt like you're part of a long march. Like, this is the way it felt, right? The whole apparatus is swinging together for this goal. And it was purpose-built, and it was purposeful, and it wouldn't last forever. But it was very exciting.
So when you mentioned the apparatus comes together, that's exactly what the Western world is fearing about, right?
It's no different in the sense that if you're doing a big public project, the apparatus has to come together. Yes. If you try to do high-speed rail in California, it's like which we're trying slowly. But you need an apparatus. You need to be able to connect the dots in any public works. And these were all public works. These were just big public projects. And done at scale, and they were done in a period of time. And I think they're, I wouldn't say over, but yeah, we're very clearly in a new time, a new place now. So that kind of project, I haven't seen as much in the last couple of years. I certainly haven't done any.
Yeah. It always strikes me when you look at China, they do a lot of different things and you see where's the cohesion. But if you look at it from the long term or far, a bit far away, you see clearly what they're doing. I always refer to electrical vehicles like in Germany or in the US, where people have drive maybe 400 or 500 kilometers with an electrical car. It's not really useful, an electrical car. But in China, they're really built for the cities because then you have the high-speed rails who go very fast for every different city. It's a very different concept.
Yeah.
So they thought about it a long time ago. And I also remember when they started to go to innovation and high-tech, they built these huge high-tech parks and they were all empty. And I thought, oh my God,
Yeah.
what are you going to do with this? And now they're all filled, of course.
Yeah.
But you need to really take a step back and only then you understand what the not saying a grand plan, but how they operate this country, of
No,
course.
it's not a grand plan per se. And I know some of your other guests have talked about it. So my view is that there are goals,
Yeah.
there are objectives, there are directions. And then everything else is about incentives. And the incentives are pretty strong to get towards the goal. And if you are the one person who's standing out saying, no, I'm not going to do it, that generally doesn't happen here. So then the governance of all of that is basically negative. It's just somebody standing up at the front and saying, no.
Yes.
It's like, no,
Yes.
you can't do that. You can't do that. Those two projects, they need to be put together, something like that. And that's kind of what the central government does.
Yeah.
It administers the incentives, which is how do you know you have them? Well, because somebody got promoted, which is largely, I think, what it is. It promulgates the thinking about what's the goal, and so everybody knows, and it's kind of what the 5-year plan process is there to do. And then it says no a lot. And or it tries to basically govern the direction of the project, and which it resolves disputes and so forth. So that's why NDRC people, the Planning Commission, National Development and Reform Commission, are generally viewed as the most hated people in China,
Yes.
because they're just sitting there on top of a big backlog. That's very intentional.
Yes.
They're just not saying no. They're not saying yes. They're just not saying anything.
Yes.
So everybody gets frustrated, and that's intentional. So yeah, that's the model. So it's not a plan as much as it is I would say, a shared aspiration. Because who in China doesn't want China to become successful? Which Chinese person is standing out there saying, yeah, I'd like us to stay exactly as we are right now.
Yes.
In fact, I'd like to become like it was in my parents' generation. It's like, no, that person doesn't exist.
No,
Right.
very true.
Well, you've got almost 40 years here, and Sven has about 20. I have about 15. That's that's like 65 years, isn't it? A lot of time.
675, right?
75.
Business person.
That's the difference.
Social scientist. Okay.
And so, we can be accused of being in a China bubble. And I know you talk to Americans or policymakers in the U.S. And, how do you communicate the reality of China in this kind of like much deteriorating environment between the U.S. and China?
Oh, I don't know if I can, honestly. I mean, I think the best we can do is point out sort of internal contradictions in logic. It's like, well, if you really think it's a bad idea for them to do this, then shouldn't you let them do it? It'll fall over and be a bad idea. But no, I think China's a full body experience, I often say. And so it's like, if you want to understand China, come to China, because this is how it works. You get to sort of look around, feel, touch, taste, the whole patterns of behavior, which are really what drives the whole place. And then make your conclusions. In the interim, I would just hope that people, first of all, don't reason from analogy. And it's like, oh, this must be like the Soviet Union.
Right.
It's like, or this must be like Japan or something. No, it doesn't. It shouldn't. It doesn't have to be. It's like itself. So come here, find out. And then the rest of it is, I think, just, reasonably adjusted scenarios, thinking about what are the range of possibilities that could come, and then how does one sort of plan for one's own interests. And that would be the most effective thing. If most people outside China could just think about their own interest and what is there, how does China play to that? What's the role? Then I think you'd get more rational policy making.
So what's the U.S. doing wrong, and what's the U.S. doing right, you think about China?
Well, I don't, well, what's doing right is, first of all, we have 40 years of collaboration. And American companies have been very successful here, and they made a lot of money. So I think American companies do know how to make money in China. You go out on the street and you see it, whether it's Starbucks or KFC or historically General Motors. Can't really say that right now, but Tesla. And or you go to your doctors and you take your drugs that are coming from Pfizer and wherever. So I mean, American companies do know how to make money here, and of course there are things that we could do to help American companies make even more money, and we should be aggressive as a government to stand up for them, sort of whether it's intellectual property issues or it's government procurement. I mean, there are plenty of things that we can pick on and to say, no, this playing field is not even and equal. But what I think is most challenging or what's most counterproductive is to turn away from the marketplace, is to say, okay, no, I just want to deprioritize it, because if you don't come to China, China will come to you. And it will come stronger and with more competitive capabilities and with more resources. And I think for the US government, we sort of think about how can we help our companies compete more effectively, which ultimately comes back to actually, if we think they're U.S. companies, which is an arguable point, but investing in the U.S. So there are two ways to run a race. One is to, trip the other guy, and the other one is to run faster.
Right.
So I think running faster is what we need to do more of, a little bit less of trying to trip the other guy, because I don't think it works very well either. But, so running faster is all about talent. It's about ease of doing business. It is about R&D. These are important things that the U.S. has opportunities to do better on.
I agree that tripping the other guy probably won't help that much. On the other hand, talking about the consultancy business, last year there was this uproar that, the state-owned companies are not allowed to work with the Big Four anymore for auditing purposes. Because they say, well, that's for data surveillance, whatever the reason might be. So there you can say, well, slowly the Big Four being pushed out of the market. Is that something that you will feel the same as McKinsey, or say, well, this is actually very unfair, or is there a reason behind all this?
Well, I haven't personally experienced any of that, and I think that these professions, legal is also a bit like that historically, and are subject to this type of national privilege. And I can only say I do think it's somewhat counterproductive. I'm not quite sure why that's happening in the accounting field. I for example, had the privilege of hanging out with Lola Woetzel once in a while, and former finance minister, and he would bewail the fact that he could no longer use international accounting firms to audit the state enterprises, because he felt the quality of the information he was getting from the local versions was, let's just say, not entirely accurate.
Yes,
for whatever reason.
Sure.
And so that, I think that's a problem. I think they will, as I said, this kind of thing is you shoot yourself in the foot, and eventually you get a big fraud case, or somebody has to write off all the assets. In which case, if you're sort of looking at that, it's a real, you say, leopards ate my face moment. So, you voted for this thing, and now you got the consequences of it, and that's the outcome, I think, of a lot of that type of protectionist policy that isn't really fact-based. It's not really helping, and what's it tied to? I mean, if it was tied to some kind of a performance improvement process, then maybe. But I mean, in something like that, I'm not sure what the rationale is.
Well, in recent years, China has turned a bit more ideological, I think, since the pandemic especially. But over the long course of your career here, I think we'd have to say it's been a rational process of development where people are thinking rationally and pragmatically to develop China further. And if anything, we can certainly say that China has been successful at that. So that's kind of, I think, one of the takeaways of the experience you've had here myself. A rational place.
I mean, I think it is. It's a rational place on the street. I'm not entirely sure it's a rational place in Beijing or in Zhongnanhai, because I came here when they were talking about spiritual civilization and things like that. And you listen to this person talking about, capitalism or socialism with Chinese characteristics, and you think, what exactly do they mean? There's a whole string of Marxist adjectives after that. And then you go out on the street and you say, oh, wow, it's capitalism. It seems like it's working. And there's lots of people selling things.
Make money.
It's money. As opposed to, and I heard this from a Wall Street Journal reporter, India. So when you listen to the government, it sounds very rational, and they're saying, talking in an educated accent and all the rest of it. And then you go out on the street and you say, oh my God.
It's a different animal in India, sure.
So, yeah.
Well, in China, there's definitely what you say for public consumption and what you do, actually. It's often very different.
This is a country with cognitive dissonance as a way of life.
Right. We've said that before. It's a great way to think about it.
So,
Which is a great ending, by the way.
but you know, we're privileged. I always felt I am privileged to have been part of this journey, and I think there's quite a lot more to come. And the world should, you know, sort of look at that, appreciate, figure out what it means to it, and hopefully make it a good thing.